Hello, everyone. Um, Thank you for making it today. Um, Welcome to today's special webinar hosted by Albanians for America, a growing advocacy organization dedicated to strengthening the Albanian voice in Washington and building bridges between the Albanian diaspora and U.S. policymakers. The AFA is a 501c4 bipartisan advocacy organization representing Albanian American interests on Capitol Hill. We also work to encourage Albanian Americans to run for local, state, and federal office. And we work to strengthen Albania-U.S. relations, protect Kosovo's sovereignty, and work to seek justice and human rights for all Albanians living in the Balkans. My name is Murat Muftari, and I'll be hosting today's webinar on behalf of AFA. Thank you, Doc and Gino, for the opportunity. Joining me today as co-host is Ilana Tselai, one of our interns here at AFA. She'll be helping to moderate the discussion and coordinate the Q&A session. Just some housekeeping notes. If you have questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Ilana will invite selected participants to join the panel and ask their questions. Also, we'd love for you to stay connected to AFA. If you haven't done so, please like and follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and X. And also, our website is a great place for information, albaniansforamerica.org. You can sign up to become a member there. It's only $10 per year, and with your membership, you'll receive a personalized AFA membership card and an Albanian American pin. All right, so today we're honored to be joined by a distinguished guest, someone who has played a critical role in shaping U.S.-Albania relations, former U.S. Ambassador to Albania, Ambassador Arvizu. Thank you, sir. A quick bio on the ambassador. He has served for 36 years as a Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, retiring in 2017 with the rank of Minister Counselor. He enjoys meeting with university and high school students to discuss American diplomatic history, national security, and international relations. Most of Alex's overseas assignments in the Foreign Service were in the Asia-Pacific region. His final overseas assignment was as U.S. Ambassador to Albania from late 2010 to early 2015. While in the capital of Tirana or traveling around the country, he developed great admiration and respect for the courage and resilience of the Albanian people to overcome the harsh legacy of more than three decades of dictatorial communist rule. Alex is a first-generation American. He was born on a U.S. Army base in Japan and grew up in Colorado Springs. He made a career in the U.S. Army, retiring as a sergeant major after 30 years as an infantryman from the Second World War to Vietnam. Most recently, Alex was the director of the Donald F. McHenry Fellowship Program at Georgetown University. In that capacity, he worked as an administrator, instructor, and mentor for a select cohort of master's degree candidates in the School of Foreign Service who dedicated themselves to pursue a transformative career in global public service. Alex currently resides in Arlington, Virginia with his wife and teenage daughter. He graduated from Georgetown University prior to joining the Foreign Service in 1981. He enjoys reading about the Cold War history and is an avid fan of Detroit Tigers baseball and of the Georgetown women's and men's athletic teams. Ambassador Arvizu's deep experience in diplomacy, his time serving in Tirana, and his continued engagement in Balkan affairs make him uniquely positioned to help us understand where we've been, where we are, and where we must go. Our discussion will focus on key issues facing Albanians today, the role of U.S. policy in the region, and how we, as Albanian Americans and allies, can become more effective advocates. Welcome, Ambassador. On behalf of AFA, thank you for your time this evening. And as a fellow veteran and civil servant, I also want to thank you for your distinguished service to our country. Thank you.
Great. Murat, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. It's great to see everyone virtually. I tapped the button and recognized a lot of familiar, if not faces, then names and faces in the audience. And I know some people will probably be joining the taped version or the video version. I'm really honored and want to thank you, Murat, Alana, and AFA for this great opportunity. I mentioned, that is an updated bio, and I mentioned that I really do enjoy speaking with students primarily. I, have a great attachment to Georgetown and spoke with some Albanian and Kosovar students while at Georgetown. So let's get right to it. What I thought I would do is just give you a very quick, for lack of a better term, like my stump speech when talking about Albania with informed audiences such as yourselves. It's sort of my main pitch and themes. And then I believe, Murat, you'll be guiding us through maybe some subcategories. I'll try to keep these answers or these comments pretty short and clip, but there are 5 basic takeaways. Not that you're going to be quizzed on any of this, but if you just want to keep a mental or even written note of some of the key points that at least I'm trying to impart to you, there will be 5 that I've written down here. I'll try not to wander and add too many more. Let me just begin by saying that of my 36 years of public service, I counted a couple times, and about 25 of those years were spent either working in Asia Pacific or working back here in Washington on Asia Pacific issues. I would hesitate to call myself an Asia Pacific expert, but that's where I spent a lot of time. And I feel fairly knowledgeable with it. It's a very large, complex region. And, it stands to reason that, gee, I thought I was working my way towards possibly being an ambassador, out in the region. It didn't happen for a reason. It was a human factor that I think we've all encountered, or if you haven't encountered it yet, it will happen to you, where things seem to be going along swimmingly, but then life throws you a curveball. This happened to me shortly before, like around 2009. I wasn't sure what would happen. And, just to make a long story short, Albania kind of fell into my lap. I had never visited the region before. I knew about Enver Hoxha. I knew a little bit about Albania's difficult post-war history, but I knew nothing about a gentleman named Sali Berisha or someone named Fatos Nano or Edi Rama, really nothing at all. And I know that there are some people said, what is the deal here? And I think that's an understandable question. I will say this, through circumstances, I ended up spending 4 years altogether in Albania, 4 full years from the end of 2010 to the beginning of 2015. I was there for a difficult period with the January 21, 2010 civil disturbances, some landmark elections, Luli Basha, winning the mayoral race against Edi Rama triumphing over Sali Berisha. So these were pretty significant milestones for Albania as a country and in the history of U.S.-Albania post-war relations. But I feel, because I sort of went in with a blank slate, that, unlike somebody maybe who's been in the Balkans, has talked a lot, it was really a blank slate for me. And I was immediately struck by, the hospitality, the warmth of the Albanian people, which everyone described to me, so in that sense, I wasn't surprised by that fact, but I was surprised by the depth and the extent of it. And it's something that really touched me. And I left Albania about 10 years ago. It was 10 years ago this past January. I still stay in touch with the Asia Pacific scene, but I do a lot more with Albania, think more about Albania than all the other places combined. And that's for a reason. It's the Albanian people, people like your parents and your uncles and aunts, but also young people like you. So I try to keep up with it. And, I do love the country. I do love the people. I've never forgotten the fact that I'm an American diplomat. I represented my country. And despite all the difficulties here at home, and we'll probably touch upon that a little bit. I'm still an American. I'm not an Albanian. These issues that we talk about, I love talking about them, but they're not my problem to solve. I don't see them as Americans' problems to solve. They're truly Albanian issues. But I speak as someone who cares deeply about your country, your people, your nation, your history, culture. I am immensely respectful of it, and just want to wish the best for everyone affiliated with Albania. So let me just very quickly go through what I see as like the most salient issues. And then, as I said, as we get into this discussion, we can either dig down a little bit more or go in some other direction. The first one, of course, whenever you talk to anyone about Albania, the issue that comes up is official corruption and its corrosive effect. It's absolutely true. In many respects, I see Albania as having come a long ways just in the last 10 years. I think that's undeniable. The number of tourists, visitors, the figures don't lie. I visited Albania a couple of times, maybe 3 times in recent years, and was just really struck. More Albanians are traveling abroad, more to Asia, the Middle East, to America. So all this interplay, this interaction with outside forces, outside peoples, influences, it's a great thing. It's an absolutely great thing. I see, a lot of construction taking place in Tirana on the coastline. That's can be a mixed bag. I'm sure some of you have some thoughts on that. Again, there are pros as well as cons, for the obvious reasons. But one thing that has struck me is how, to a person, the people with whom I've spoken from Albania, many of them young people, have said, Ambassador, the official corruption in Albania has gotten worse in the last 10 years. And I said, really? And I said, but most people seem to have a job. And, my friends, they seem to be doing okay. And I said, no, we have our jobs. We're able to take our vacations and things like that. But, the basic underlying corruption is as bad as ever, if not worse. And secondly, the gap between, the truly wealthy, the abnormally wealthy, and those of us getting by, that seems to be growing. And I said, that's really unfortunate. And apparently, based on some fairly reliable statistics I've seen, that can be, that helps explain in large part why there are a lot of young people in particular who are leaving Albania or seeking to leave Albania. I hesitate to remind people that this is not a phenomenon that's unique to Albania. It's certainly a characteristic of a lot of your neighboring states in Eastern and Central Europe. Certainly, I've seen it in other parts of Asia and elsewhere. But yes, it's undeniably a big problem, and there are no easy solutions. We can talk about judicial reform and other things, but it's quite problematic. My second point, and the 2 or 3 are I can just spend 1 minute each on each. And that is the things I respectfully caution or urge Albanians and Kosovars to take into account as Albania and Kosovo become a little bit more prominent on the regional and global scene. One of those is to, I certainly hope, avoid at all costs and don't give any fuel to what I call hyper nationalism or extreme nationalism. The so-called Greater Albania phenomenon. I understand, the tremendous pride you have in the concept of the Greater Albania. To be quite honest, Albania. It's unusual in that it is truly linked to different aspects of culture, common language, tradition, history, food. The fact that, there are Northern Albanians and Southern Albanians, but yeah, there are linguistic differences, but, the religious diversity that is Albania, you can't tell, and I get, my teeth kind of start, I start clenching my teeth when I hear, well, intelligent, well-meaning people in the USA, Albania is such a peaceful Muslim country. And I say, well, it's not a Muslim country. And I say, well, yeah, it is. And I said, if you, according to statistics, yes, it's majority Muslim, but it's not like the concept that you have. You can't tell me that the Albanians who are Catholic or the Albanians who are Orthodox Christian or those who are Bektashi are any less nationalistic or any less loving of their country than the Sunni Muslims. So that's, what I mean about the importance of having pride in your country, but not letting it break down, which is a phenomenon that we see in other parts of the Balkans, right? I mean, you're more familiar with that than I am. And that gets to my second point, which is, one other, ism to avoid is religious extremism. Now, I don't have much concern about this because, you look at trends, and I was in Albania when the Islamic State was, growing in prominence. Islamic State actually claimed wide swaths of territory, and in the barren areas of Iraq and Syria. I think there's still, tiny remnants out there. And there were some Albanians and a slightly larger number group of Kosovars who were recruited, to become jihadists. And I know that there were, some alarm bells ringing, understandably. Obviously, that Islamic State has been, neutralized effectively, fairly neutralized. I don't see it as a huge threat, to peace and stability anywhere, but things like that never go away completely. So again, extreme nationalism, extreme religious extremes are two things I think that, that you want to avoid and do everything you can to avoid. So those are, 1, 2, and 3. My fourth point would be that it's important for Albania to continue on the path that I've always called a pro-Western path or a pro-Atlantic path. So, different like concentric circles. I'm convinced that Albania is very much a part of Europe. I'm convinced of that because of my conversations with countless numbers of Albanians. They identify with Europe. They feel part of Europe, even though Europe has not always been all that welcoming towards Albanians, right? And we can get into that conversation a little bit. But, I just feel more convinced than ever that Albania's positive future lies in strengthening those ties with the rest of Europe and across the Atlantic. Albania is on the path towards integration. I've kind of lost track of, sort of the target date. I've heard 2030. Don't forget that date or, that process has as much to do with the EU 27 as it does what's actually happening in Albania, or North Macedonia, or Bosnia Herzegovina, or Serbia, So yes, there are certain criteria, and it's a very elaborate process that's, way too complicated for my simple mind to absorb. But I used to get a little bit annoyed when I would hear, well-meaning people from Brussels say, well, the Albanians need to do their homework, right? That was, sort of a rather clumsy way of saying, to adhere to the criteria. The criteria are good, but it sounds too much like a school marm. It's frankly, it's a little bit insulting. And I know that because it's taken a long time to reach that point, some Albanians say, you know what, maybe it's just not worth it. And I would just really, really encourage you to not succumb to that kind of negative thinking. It's important because it matters to your country and to your people, even though, sometimes it seems a little unfair. It is unfair. And because I can speak freely, it's my sense that the bar has always been set a little bit higher for Albania and for Kosovo, both, when they're looked at by their European partners. We can go into why that's the case, but that's just my opinion. So Albania is a part of Europe, but then the last point is, and this is in a way the one where I've been giving it the most thought lately, and that is the relationship with the United States and the larger, and by extension, the Euro-Atlantic, since we're the ones across the Atlantic, together with Canada and some others. And that is that, since the fall of communism in 91, certainly through my time there, which would have been 2015, and I say it lasted a couple more years, through the time when Ambassador Donald Liu was the ambassador, the sense of pro-Americanism in Albania was just overwhelming. It was, never 100%, nor should it have been 100%, but it was overwhelming. And more than just absolute numbers, it was my sense that the, pro-US sentiment was kind of nonpartisan. Sure, people who really are political junkies like me followed American politics, and some like the Republican Party a little bit more, some like the Democratic Party a lot more. But more importantly, people here in the US who knew about Albania, and it was not a large number, but people, whether they were Republican or Democrat, they said Albanians are wonderful. They're so pro-American. They're so with us, and embrace the spirit of what American tries to stand for. I really believe that. That doesn't mean that America was a perfect country or didn't make mistakes. Goodness, we certainly did. Excuse me. But that was always reassuring. I felt like whenever I wade into crowds or engaged in debates, it was a very pro-American audience. I'm very concerned that because of the extreme hyperpolarization we see in this country, and again, I don't want to get into this side versus that side, but it is a fact. It's an indisputable fact that otherwise well-meaning Albanians are getting sucked into that divide, and they're falling off that cliff. And yeah, it's primarily Albanian Americans, so Albanians living here, either, well, primarily citizens or possibly, legal permanent residents, but just Albanians in general. And again, my view is you can have your preferences, like most Americans, but I see a danger of thinking, yeah, make America great now. If your family is pro-DP, maybe, or has a background in the Democratic Party of Albania, you hear all this nasty stuff about George Soros and transgender people and this and that and this and that. And, Albania's a little bit conservative society to begin with. And so, those, it just pains me when I hear Albanians say, those Democrats, or those Republicans. And, to be very blunt, I'm not sure you Albanians have a basis to judge that about politics here in America. It's very complicated. We're not America. I mean, we're not Albania. We have a multicultural, multi-ethnic society with a history of, a horrible history of slavery. And prior to that, a horrible, you know, textbook case of genocide of the Native Americans. Those are facts. They're indisputable. Now, I love America. And I think that despite, some very difficult times, we've emerged to be, practically a unique country in the history of the world. I proclaim my allegiance, my love, my patriot for America. But I don't believe in hiding that. I believe that's part of what makes America great. And it's just me, but when I see people like from Albania or anywhere for that matter taking sides, I'm worried that that really, really tight bond between our peoples, that could fray if you're not careful and if you're not judicious. Okay. Anyway, I went on a little bit longer than I thought, but those are just some things that I wanted to lay out. And Murat, why don't I turn it over to you? And not to make your life more difficult, but I probably threw a few curveballs your way. But go ahead and pick,
Sure.
from your list. You'll notice that I spent most of my time on Albania. I'll be honest with you. I am not deeply versed in Kosovo, but of course I understand the main contours and do try to follow developments. But just I won't be able to go as in depth with Kosovo as with Albania. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. One I just read a poll to your point about, continuing Albanians' alignment to the West and to the US. And it still came out where Albania and Kosovo were number one and two in pro-American views and pro-EU alignment. So, I think to your point, I think there is some challenges with the polarization and kind of taking sides and not falling into that trap, for Albanians that reside, in the Balkans. But, um, I think they're just as interested to see through, these challenges as Albanian Americans and Americans are. But one thing on, so sticking to Albania here, looking ahead, in this time of a lot of global disruption and changes going on, what strategic interest does the U.S. have in Albania and the Western Balkans, that the Albanian American community should better understand? I mean, it's
Yeah,
always been on the fault line, right? It's always been on the fault line between, major, players and empires and regions, but looking kind of forward, in this next, let's call it 5 to 10 years.
it's certainly on the fault lines. And again, in the spirit of candor, I will sort of tell you as I see it. For those of you in the United States, and I gather it's probably most of you or many of you, you'll know that the world looks really different from here. And right now, one reason we're having such a hard time here with our politics is, there's so much of a domestic focus. I don't know if you caught clips of President Trump's and Secretary Hegseth's extraordinary meeting with all these generals and admirals today, but they talked about threats to the United States, primarily from within. And frankly, a lot of Americans would agree, but with a twist there. That's never been something that American service members have thought of. Sure, we're officials are sworn to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But there's no question that there are threats to global peace and security. You look at what Russia has done in invading Ukraine and menacing a lot of neighboring states. They would be doing the same in Albania if the terrain in Albania weren't so hostile towards Russia. That hasn't kept them from trying. and I've asked about that. I say, what about the Russian? And they say, the Russians are so discredited from the past that they basically don't bother. Okay, that's a, don't be complacent, but it's different. There's not a Russian diaspora in significantly in the Balkans. Serbia's a different case, right? And again, not to compare Serbia with Albania, but to the larger question of the perspectives. Frankly, with America, we're flying at this 30,000-foot level, trying to preserve American interests by not having conflagrations around the world. The conflict in the Middle East with Gaza, it's a humanitarian catastrophe, a huge issue, and it's going to have implications for American politics. And it's just massive. It's a very complicated issue, so there's that. There's Russia and Ukraine. I can't believe that, this invasion, taking place in the heart of Europe is not the front burner issue, but, it's the second burner. There's a conflict that, is raging out of control, and it has been for some years now in Sudan. And that doesn't have, received nearly as much attention, but involves a lot of regional players, including regional players in Central and Eastern Europe, like Turkey, Libya, Egypt, the Gulf states. So again, there are a lot of complex movements, interplay of forces that Albania is not directly involved in, that the neighboring countries are not directly involved in, but that are of concern to the United States. And I think that, in the larger sense, for the Western Balkans, the big concern on the part of Americans who look at that part of the world is that, the anti-democratic forces, the authoritarian forces, led by, let's be honest, it is Russia, are going to weaken and degrade the institutions. And it could happen even in Albania or Kosovo. And you say, how is that possible? Here's how it's possible. They're not going to try to turn Albania or Kosovo into anti-American camps, right? That's not going to happen. It's like, it goes against the laws of physics. But what if, and I say what if because this is what they're doing, they weaken Albanians and Kosovars' perceptions of what the West means and what it brings. And, there's a lot of whispering by use of social media, other vehicles, saying, what, they really don't want you. And, they're trying to keep you down. The old exploitation argument. And, I think Turkey's a very important partner for Albania and for Kosovo, for Bosnia, for that matter, for all the, Turkey's a major regional power. And we have our differences with Turkey, but it's an important partner in security and economic issues, even though it's not a member of the EU. And there's a 500-year history between the Albanian territories and Turkey. It should be that way. But, there are folks who say, what, you don't have to pursue the Western path. You can be more like, almost like a junior partner of Turkey. I don't think you want that. You want a full partner's fine. You should, it's in your interest to have good relations with Turkey. But no, you don't want to be a vassal. You had that experience for 500 years. Turkey's fine by itself. You're your own self. The other Balkan countries are your separate self. So I think the way the borders are drawn now, the way the countries exist now, no fighting, the peaceful resolution of disputes. And of course, the main outstanding one is Kosovo and Serbia. But, there remains some tensions in Macedonia, as we know. I think that, things are not at a boiling point now, but, they do go up and down. And people who follow Macedonia closely tell me, I always watch very closely with that. So less concern for Albania, but for the region. And that it's in that sense that I think it's really important for Albania to play a strong constructive role, to not, get under the skin of, neighbors, even when there might be provocations, even when there might be like grievances. And again, not to name places, but your relationship with Greece, it's always been a little hot and cold, right? With Serbia. And that doesn't mean you have to take everything lying down, but to not overreact to certain things, to try to look for constructive, peaceful ways, without getting folks riled up. Because once that happens, then sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to control the outcome. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. And it led to you kind of answered my follow-up question, which was about regional players like Serbia and Russia and the influence, trying to exploit divisions. And you kind of answered that, but my follow-up to that question is, what should Albanian advocates do in response to these? And you kind of just started leading into that right now of holding our form and being constructive and not kind of taking the bait. But Russia right now, I mean, like you said, they still try to do things, through social media and other platforms to try to drive these divisions of what it means to align with the West. And what could we as Albanian Americans or as Albanians living in the region there, do to make sure, we're still advocating and responding in some way, to these provocations. And
Right. No, that's a great question. And, not to sound like somebody who's, playing with a geopolitical chessboard back here or anything, but, the forces, larger forces around the world, whether it be Russian power, Chinese power, Gulf state power, I guess those are three, different centers of gravity. They all seek to exert some influence in different parts of the world, whether it's Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, or the Western Balkans. I think, and I laugh just because it's a product of history. But given Albania's extremely difficult post-war history, where Hoxha was briefly aligned with Tito, very very briefly, as fellow partisans, right? But then for several years under sway of the Soviet Union, and then that fell apart, and then China. So, and then finally Hoxha and Ramiz Ali decided to go at it on their own, and eventually it all collapsed like a house of cards. But people who understand Europe deeply tell me something, that there's still some resonance, for the old days in parts of Eastern Europe. And every once in a while, I'll even hear some Albanians who get really fed up saying, well, all this crap these days. And, but when you press them, and with some raki or even, just unliquored conversation, you say, okay, if you're old enough to remember the Hoxha years, really? And it's, well, maybe not. Or the Russian, when the Russians were kind of in control of things, really? Or the Chinese, how strange is that? And people say, no. As much as we complain about, the current days, no, you're right. We have to be clear-eyed, sober about what the reality is. So I think that given that Albania has had that experience, and given that Kosovo had a different path under Yugoslavia, so in those critical years in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, Kosovo was freer, a lot freer than Albania, but then of course had to pay a heavy price, right? In the 80s and the 90s, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, and they bore the brunt of, together with Bosnia and Herzegovina, obviously. Um, but the point being that Albania today, Kosovo today, Kosovo is an independent state since 2008. Sadly, unfortunately, regrettably, still not a member of the UN. And I know, certain people who keep track of the number of countries, recognizing Kosovo. It's it always seems to hover around 100. I think it's maddening to me that, above and beyond places like Russia and China, but I think India does not recognize Kosovo. I believe Brazil does not. There are a lot of, middle powers that don't recognize Kosovo. I think that's really unfortunate. And but by the same token, most Kosovars are able to travel. A Kosovo passport does enable one either to travel, or you can obtain a travel document that gives you freedom of movement. The internet is free and open, to the best of my knowledge, in Kosovo. So again, look at the glass being half full, take advantage of that openness. If you are Kosovar American, to again not be steeped in frustration and agony and resentment, but use that to momentum to and let it be encouragement to you, inspiration to you, to obtain full recognition, full UN voting rights. You're already in with the right crowd. All of Western Europe, almost all of Western Europe. I guess there are still 4 or 5 countries, right? Again, not for reasons of Kosovo, but I believe it's Spain, Romania, who else? It was Slovakia. There are like 4 or 5 countries that do not recognize Kosovo. It's all for their domestic reasons. Spain with their situation, their political situation.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
let's stick on the topic of Kosovo here for a minute. I know we have a question in the crowd on Kosovo, but before we get to their question, I'm just going to kind of lead into that with what you're kind of going towards here is, what can the U.S. do, or Albanian Americans, advocating to strengthen Kosovo's sovereignty and into UN integration, membership and NATO membership. Like, what can we do and what can US do to keep pushing that forward, the UN membership, NATO membership, and are those realistic things, in the near future?
So a couple.
Obviously, US still has a very strategic base in Kosovo, with Camp Bondsteel that they've other countries have been interested in taking over, and the US has said no. So, it doesn't seem like US, military interests are going away, but what can we really, can we do from this side of the Atlantic to continue to push, for those memberships?
There are a few things, and again, it's I have thought about this, and it's not as if it's easy to like say, okay, we're going to have this galvanizing effort, and we're going to have this initiative. I think it's kind of a slow roll kind of thing, but to just keep a mental list of important points to emphasize whenever there's an opportunity with a local politician in Massachusetts or Michigan, or when you visit a senator or congressman, make sure you have your facts straight, but just say, Albania is a member of NATO, and we've contributed, some Albanian service members, have died in Afghanistan and Iraq. But we're a full member of NATO. Just recently had the USS Mount Whitney, the main command ship for the Sixth Fleet, visited Porto Romano, I believe. So we're there. We're with you in the Western country. But Albania is still not in the EU. and we're doing our part, but we need continued American support for that. Just make sure people don't assume. A lot of Americans don't know that Albania is in NATO, and a lot of Americans don't know that Albania is trying to get into the EU, or they think they're in the EU already. So again, just general education, information sharing. With respect to Kosovo, that one's a little bit more complicated. I think, if I were an Albanian American or Kosovo American, I would seek out every Indian American, Indian student, Chinese student, go down the list of significant countries that do not recognize Kosovo. Brazil, pretty sure Brazil's on there. Pull out that list. There are a lot of students, from these countries studying in the United States. I don't think they have a clue. I think they would know. They would say, "You're not? Why not?" And then, be armed with some talking points, and then say, it's all related, and say, "Hey, can I take you out for pizza?" Or, let's go have a drink some, and I'll tell you. And again, not the hard sell or anything like that, but say, it's caught up in the politics. It's in the politics of New Delhi, or the politics of Brasilia, or, wherever, South Africa. There are a lot of African students. Most of the African countries don't recognize Kosovo. Do you think that's got anything to do with Kosovo, really? No. It's because they're towing that line, sort of the anti-West line. Now, you're probably not going to have much success changing views in those African capitals. But these young people studying here, who are being exposed to, liberal thoughts and ideas, explain that, there are real consequences to what your government is doing by not recognizing. We are with you. We Kosovars have a lot more in common with you than we do with a lot of other people in the world. So what gives here? That's what I would do.
Great. Yes, to stick on Kosovo and one more kind of topic, we have a question in the audience that, since we're talking Kosovo right now, it's a little more of a current event. Alana, do you want to allow put Chele on the line here, and she can ask the question directly? Otherwise, I could read it.
Yeah, I asked her. She said she would like it to be read out loud. So
Oh, okay,
if you'd like to, yeah.
sure. So we have someone listening in. They were born and raised in Kosovo, and but they've currently living and working in the U.S. for 30 years. That being said, they never forget what the U.S. did for Kosovo, and the Albanians in Kosovo are the most pro-American people in the world, like we mentioned. But recently, she's concerned with the U.S. policy cutting strategic talk ties with Kosovo. If you've seen, the strategic dialogue was recently announced that it was frozen with Kosovo's current government, specifically Albin Kurti. What is your take on this, and what would it take for the U.S. to revive or change this decision?
Yeah.
This is very current, right? This just happened, I think, within the last week.
Was that actual announcement made then?
Yeah, there was an announcement from the U.S. Embassy and the State Department on this freeze in strategic dialogue.
Again, I'm not a U.S. government official, so
Understood.
I'm not privy to all the ins and the outs, but I do have some views, and they're kind of mixed. I've always felt, after spending time in that part of the world, in the Western Balkans, and I mentioned it briefly in my opening remarks, which is that I've always felt that Albanians and Kosovars, the bar's a little bit higher for you guys. You're held to a little bit different standard. To be quite honest, and again, this is my opinion, I think the Serbs are able to get away with, you know, any number of shenanigans. You know, they'll get slapped on the wrist. They'll be criticized, you know, from the State Department or the embassies or something like that. But it's, to me, it almost becomes pro forma, because there is such a strong feeling that, you know, Serbia, you know, that we, the West, you know, but the U.S. needs to do everything it can, given our, you know, our deep involvement, right, especially in the 90s and throughout with the Dayton Accords and beyond, you know, that work is incomplete and we need to finish it. You know, the integration of Serbia into, you know, the Western camp seems like a pretty tall order, right? And, you know, in my mind, obviously you can't give that up. You know, you have to keep working at that. They're a difficult partner. They really are. You know, and I know there are people who can't stand Vucic. There are people who say, well, you know, he's doing the best he can. I don't know enough about that. I guess maybe I had a chance to serve in Belgrade. I didn't want to do it. You know, I just couldn't deal with that. But I think as a consequence of that, sometimes the bar is a little bit higher for Kosovo, for Pristina, in you know, those kinds of talks and that dialogue, and even, you know, with Albania in terms of dealing with the EU. That's a separate track. But you know, it took Albania a long time to get candidate status, and you know, it's taken a while, and it's going to take a while. It'll happen eventually. But I always thought, gee, you know, it seems like there are a lot of sweeteners for Serbia, and not so sweet for Kosovo in particular. Now, again, I know that there's been, you know, a fair amount of friction between the Kurti government, and he's been in office for quite some time now, and not just the United States, but other parts of Europe. I think, and again, yeah, I don't have any specific direct knowledge, but you know, there's usually enough blame to go around. You know, it sounds like certain, you know, personalities play a part of it, policies, but you know, it's born of a larger frustration that, you know, that this peace process, you know, the democratization process, you know, it's not going as smoothly as it should. Now, you know, whenever you have a situation like that, you know, there are classic examples of how do you respond? Well, you know, do you offer more carrots, more sticks, incentives, disincentives, you know? So the people who are making these decisions feel like, well, you know, that's what, you know, we want a certain desired end state. And maybe by, you know, convincing, hopefully, the Kurti government that this is not the path, that it, you know, what, as a consequence of what you're doing or what you're not doing, you know, we're not able to proceed with the strategic partnership along the same lines. I don't think, you know, we would abandon it altogether, because it's not in our interest to do so. But I think it's important, again, for tensions, you know, for people to just be in control of their emotions. And it gets back to, you know, this idea of the double standard. And again, it's easy for me to say, but you know, when it comes to the Serb communities, and you know, the separate governing structures, or you know, or semi-autonomous governing structures. Again, I'm not well versed in that, but it does seem to me that, you know, for Kosovo to attain a certain goal, sometimes you do have to bend over backwards. Sometimes it's, you know, you have to kind of swallow your pride. It's unfair. It's not right, but you know, don't lose sight of the larger goal. You have to stick to your principles, but don't cut off your nose to spite the face, as you know, the saying goes in English. You keep your eye on the prize, and just don't let emotions boil over, and it ends up clouding the judgment. And then somebody in the State Department gets pissed off, and then, you know, it gets harder and harder to put the genie back in the bottle. So you don't want it to reach that stage. I'm sorry that was kind of a generic answer, but I think hopefully I answered your question.
Sure. And big picture wise, I was pleased to see, with some of the tariff and trade war stuff going on that, essentially Kosovo and Albania were both given most favored nation kind of status at the lowest 10% threshold on tariffs versus most of the Western Balkans, which was like 30+%. So, I was happy to see that, and Kosovo actually responded to that by declaring a U.S. a tariff-free exporter into the Kosovo market. So um, like you mentioned, I do think that what we see going on with this posturing, if you will, is a little bit of just carrot stick type scenario, and I think the strategic dialogue is not going anywhere. It's just kind of taking a short pause. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, to just recognize, like if there's an impasse, recognize it for what it is. It's not a rupture. It's not a break. It is indeed a pause. We haven't lost sight of the bigger picture, and neither should our friends in Pristina or Prizren or Gilan. I mean, it's yeah.
So on that theme, kind of touching on Kurti, but also looking maybe at the Albanian side, on the Albanian, the Edi Rama and party. Do you believe Albania and Kosovo's current leadership are effectively advocating for Albanian interests on the world stage?
That's a good question. Really good question. Let's take Kosovo first. My sense is that the government has, well, whenever there's friction with the Western partners, that clearly is something that, there's always been a certain underlying tension, right? Certainly when I was there, I think it was not as difficult as it is currently, but there were the war crimes trial. There's always an overhang, because again, Kosovo, it's still emerging from that area of conflict. And 2008, that's not really a long time. There's still a lot of consolidation that needs to take place in Kosovo. So I'm not really in a position to say, oh, I think, they're doing a good job, not so good job. I think, it reflects the fact that there are still growing pains in the Kosovo polity, the political process there. There's still some shaking up, but as long as the voters there don't lose sight of the larger goals, I think that's important. And again, I don't want to inject religion into the equation too much, but as we all know, Kosovo is heavily Muslim. It's very different in terms of the ethnic and religious composition compared to Albania. And you say, well, it's 95% Albanian, but it's, what percentage of that is considered Northern Albanian, right? More mountain Albanian. It's different. It's a different mindset based on what my Albanian friends have told me, the ones in Albania proper. So there is that factor, right? Now, for Albania itself, and this one is really kind of complicated. I think personally that, and Edi Rama has been in power since 2013. I remember that very well. And I think he's been very masterful at promoting Albania's image, projecting Albania's image in the West, in the Middle East, very closely aligned and taken some difficult positions. But as you know, Albania has, I can't remember when Albania recognized a Palestinian state, but it was some time ago. They've never wavered in that. And I personally think that's great. I think it's good. I'm glad they did it then as opposed to now, because it would be more difficult to do now, with tensions being what they are. And so that's where the United States obviously is not and won't for some time. They're just too locked in. That could have been a bone of contention between Washington and Tirana. Can you imagine if Albania didn't recognize Palestine right now? But it's a fait accompli. Life goes on, right? I used to go to the Palestinian National Day celebrations. I had to check with the State Department to make sure it was okay. But so Albania is in a good place, carving out its own path. When it comes to foreign relations, trying to get more foreign tourists. A little more, reducing barriers to trade, more freedom of movement with peoples. That I think is important. Mayor Arion Viliai, who is a personal friend of mine. I know him quite well. I don't know the nature of the charges against him because they haven't been publicly revealed. I mentioned another person who probably won't be as popular with some of you, but Ilir Meta, who's also a friend of mine. These are people I know, and you can think about them as you will, but I always had productive, honest conversations with both men and people like them. They're my friends. I would go see them, both of them tomorrow if I could. Not to create a diplomatic incident or anything like that, because they're friends. They were there for me. I think that's what friends should do. Now, where I think the current government of Prime Minister Rama needs to be a little bit careful is some of the things we talked about in the beginning. Why is there this widespread perception that official corruption is worse now than it was 10 years ago? We have Spock in existence, and Spock's done some work. And I remember in the old days, people used to say, well, they need to go after some big fish. That'll send a message. My sense is, okay, you've gone after some big fish, but there's still a lot of bad small fish swimming around. And, maybe you need to go after some of those too and do a better job. It's the property disputes and every person tuning into this discussion, they have a family situation where they've probably been wronged by someone, on the wrong side of a property dispute or civil dispute, or maybe a criminal complaint of some kind. Why is that so? Why is it so hard? Because certain vested interests, they're reluctant to give up their advantages. That's where I think the socialists need to do a better job. They've done a pretty good job of spreading the good word. I think they got good contacts in the travel industry, and the Albanians have responded. If you don't have good service, and if it's not a safe country, people aren't going to come. They're coming because of what the Albanians have done. Yes, the government's done its part, but it's because the people, running the small restaurants and the small hotels and the transportation, they're honest people. They're hardworking. They're not out to cheat the foreign tourists. Of course, the tourists are going to come. So that part's going pretty well. You need to look after the environment. You don't want to ruin the coastline. Once you do, it's going to take a millennia, to come back, right? But I think in terms of fighting official corruption, you can always do better.
Yes. On that point, someone in the audience, Indri, thank you. When you were talking about the Mayor Veliai, he listed out a few of the criminal charges. One being passive corruption of high-ranking state officials, 2 being money laundering, multiple counts, 3 being bringing or keeping prohibited items in the detention prison cells, and 4 refusal to declare or falsely declare assets, to name a few. And then, as you were speaking, another question on this corruption topic came in the queue. What should we as Albanian Americans do to fight the corruption over there? Or, to I don't know, highlight it, or what role could we play as the diaspora in that?
I think, and this is kind of a tall order. It's a challenge. And that is, especially as young people, young scholars, open-minded, a liberal orientation, and I don't mean liberal versus conservative, but, open-minded. And, I know young people, they're very adept at searching for information, unearthing reports and things like that. And that is to be part of investigative reports, studies, working with people to really bring out, the truth, the objective facts about corrupt acts or suspected corrupt acts, and to point the blame where it seems to lie, not as lawyers or whatever, but as, case studies of incinerators or, hotel permits or what have you, but to avoid getting sucked into partisan political sides. And for those who heard Albanian, you understand exactly what I mean. And let me give you some very frank examples. One of my best Albanian friends, a really, really close friend of mine, is Alfred Lela, who's a well-known journalist. He used to be part of the editorial team of a newspaper that I thought was the best newspaper called Gazeta Mapo. He's conservative, he's right of center. An Albanian American, so he's an American citizen also. His views have gotten a little more conservative. When I visited Albania last year, he picked me up at the airport. He happens to be Sali Berisha's main communications person, lead on communications. So Alfred shows up at Rennes Airport to greet me. And of course, I'm recognized by a lot of people. And he's wearing a T-shirt that says "Free Sali Berisha." And, some people, were like mortified, said, you're being photographed with him. And I said, you know what? I'm not the US ambassador anymore. I'm visiting Albania. I ended up having lunch, not with the prime minister, but with his wife, Linda Rama, who's a good friend. I saw so many people. And this is one of my friends. He can wear whatever T-shirt he wants. Who am I to say, no, you cannot wear something, no, that's, what the hell, right? He is who he is. And I think, if I could kind of, at the risk of sounding like I'm promoting myself, I think one thing that made me a little bit different as an ambassador was I always tried to be of an open mind. I had to carry out US policy, but I tried really, really, really hard not to be judgmental. There was no one with whom I agreed, 100%, nobody whom I opposed 100%. And I said, you know what? In the end, it's not my country. It's a country I care deeply about, but I advocate strongly against violence, against corruption, for human rights and things like that. But I'm here to listen. I'm here to learn. If you ask my opinion, I'll tell you, But so, yeah, I know there's some people who can't stand Eddie Rama and the socialists. Others who, when you mention Sali Berisha, they roll their eyes. I have my views. I'm happy to share them personally, but, in a larger eyes, I say, look, it's not, who am I to say, who am I to judge? You can make up your own minds.
Sure. And I think I am interested to see, I think here on the world stage soon, the next NATO organized meeting between NATO members is being hosted by Albania here. So I am interested to see. They say President Trump is planning to attend.
I saw that. I think that'd be great. I think that would be wonderful. No, there's been more and more involving NATO, the European, not the EU, but is it the European political community? I think they had a meeting in Tirana a few months ago that seemed like it was a big success. No, I have to give it to Prime Minister Rama, and before him, Mayor Vili, they really put Albania on the map. I'm not whitewashing things, and there are things that both have done that can rightfully be criticized, but I think that they do deserve credit, for having the personalities and the policies to spread the good word about Albania.
One question from Elia Zenku in the audience. He highlights how your service as ambassador to Albania and your experience during the transition of power that included the victims of the demonstrations in January 2011. Your work was highly regarded to have actively contributed to calm the delicate situation. You were very present and subtle, with things, and sometimes direct if you had to be, to get that transition of power, based on the elections results. And now he highlights how we are now in another phase of extreme polarization between the two political poles, and would love to hear your thoughts on what nudges or interventions would you suggest to improve the balance of power and ensure political fights don't escalate into violence between Albanians.
Yeah. Again, I'll be very frank and very honest. Voters need to be presented with a choice, a real choice. And in the early parts of the Republic, Berisha went through his moments, and then Fatos Nano came along, and then Rama. So it's pretty much they're not evenly split. That's part of the challenge. There have always been more socialists than Democrats. After in the immediate fall of communism, the DP came to power because again, Berisha was a very skilled politician and used a lot of instruments to get support. But traditionally, the conservatives in Albania, they've been in the minority. So it's always going to be a little bit of an uphill climb for them. And when you talk about votes, there are campaigns and they become very sophisticated. And I know about the vote buying, and I know that happens, just to some extent. But for the conservatives, notice I'm not saying the DP, but for the conservatives in Albania to do well in national elections, there has to be, for me, a reform, a renovation. The previous times, I don't think that holds the key to the future. Now, I could be wrong. And there are people who have said to me, look at America, right? We've got a president who's near 80, trying to take America back. So I don't feel like I'm on solid ground to be lecturing anyone about politics. I personally, as an American, was offended that the two candidates in the last election were Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I was offended. Is this the best we as a country can do? Different story. Okay. But, what I'm saying is that Eddie Rama is 61 years old now? He was born in 64. Yeah. So he's 61. He's still a young man. I have no idea what his plans for the future are. I know there's a lot of criticism, but the socialists have a lot of built-in advantages. Again, patronage politics, stuff that's above board, maybe stuff that's not. They do have a lot of advantages. Some people say, well, it's not great, but is it enough to really upend the system? So, if you're going to oppose the social, you can say, well, there's too much corruption. Okay, here's the alternative platform, a different voice. I think conservatives need to ask themselves, is, the shell that is the DP, is that going to be the vehicle to win back power and set Albania in a new direction? Maybe it is. I'm just asking the question, right? I don't mean to be provocative, but just, there's got to be an alternative. And based on my conversations, boy, especially young people, are kind of lukewarm at best. When they think about that, about the best I get is, well, they're all the same. It's probably not going to cut it. You need something more galvanizing, either a person or persons or a movement, to galvanize the country. But, and here's my worry, okay? Here's my big worry. And again, this is me. And I'm going to confess a little bit about my politics. I have this real allergy for ultra-nationalist politics. I identify with progressives, but I am, if anything, kind of a revolutionary, because I identify with a lot of progressive goals. I disagree with a lot of the tactics. And, in this country, don't get me started on criticism of the Democratic Party. I think their decisions have been terrible. And the messaging has been completely off base. And as much as I am not a fan or supporter of MAGA at all, and I'm not, and I don't apologize for that, but I don't think it's just the conservatives' fault. It's all of us. It's my fault too, as an American. And so the point I want to make about Albania, and I really feel strong about this, is because I know that in the rest of Europe, there are some of these real right-wing conservative movements, right? Either in the industrialized democracies, like France. Italy's a little bit of a different case, but we see it in Germany. The UK, maybe not so much. Well, it was manifested by Brexit, but there's a lot of regret now. But I'm a little bit more worried about the countries in former or Eastern Europe and the Balkans, where the consolidation of democracy and institutions, it's still an ongoing process. And I just I would be very sad if Albania swung too far in the other direction. That is, in too much of a conservative direction, where, they were like allegiances and alliances with other ultranationalist parties, because what would that lead to? The points that I was making earlier about, Albanian nationalism. And to me, that would be like a thread that if you pull on it, starts unspooling, and then a lot of not so good things could happen as a result of that. So I have no problem with Albanian conservatives. Personally, I think, yeah, that wouldn't be a bad thing, to have some rotations, if that's what the people wanted. But I think it would be really unfortunate if Albania were to take too hard a swing to the right. And when I look at the DP today, and my friend Alfred Leal and others, they are closely aligned with the MAGA crowd here in the US. They really are. And that really bothers me, because I just see nothing appealing, with the MAGA message here. I just don't. It's my opinion. I'm entitled to it, but as a career diplomat who spent all this time in Albania and talks to people, that makes me really uneasy. That makes me really nervous. And I say, you don't want to do that. Just by the same token, you don't want to overly align with the Democratic Party here. You should be in close contact with all Americans who want only good things for Albania and Kosovo. So don't be part of the group that's demonizing George Soros or this or that, because you don't really know. You're just repeating talking point. It's that echo chamber. It's not an intelligent thought. It's not based on hard evidence. If you like some of the MAGA platform, that's great, but don't be parroting those crazy talking points. That's a lazy approach to politics, and that's not good, whether you're American or Albanian or Kosovar. I told you I would be very honest.
Yeah. We have two more. I'm gonna read off two more questions from the crowd because they did get them in a little while back, and then I kind of have a big picture kind of wrap up question to end things. Burim Regai asked a question about U.S. ambassadors to Albania and Kosovo. It's now been a year since they haven't appointed an ambassador. I thought I did hear whispers on Kosovo, but do you see any particular significance in this? Does it suggest a diminished importance of both countries in the region and in Europe, or is it intended as a diplomatic message of some kind?
I don't think that's a very good question, and it's something I thought of myself. I actually think that in the case of Albania, that it's kind of a positive thing, unintended positive thing, which is that since Kosovo's independence, since the fall of communism, every single ambassador in Tirana since 91 and in Kosovo since 2008, and the charges, they've all been career officers, every single one. There's not been a single political appointee. Now, as a career officer, I think that's great. In general, you're going to get someone who is an experienced diplomat, maybe not necessarily in the region, someone like me, but I had a lot of experience going into the job. Not everyone's equal. Some are better than others. But you're going to get a career foreign service officer, right? But, our system, I don't always agree with it, but our system in the US is, there are political appointees. And if you look at the map, for most of the, more economically developed, commercially active Western European countries, they're almost all political appointees. Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, large capitals, oftentimes, they're political appointees, for better or for worse. I think it can be both. Some political appointees are amazing. Others are just terrible, unspeakably terrible. Now, the fact that it seems to me, and I don't have any inside information, but it seems to me that Albania today, especially with, I guess I should go ahead and say, the fact that Donald Trump's son-in-law, is part of this investment group that's looking to develop Sazan Island and Zvernac. Those are pretty big stakes, right? It seems to me that this administration is probably thinking about a political appointee for Albania. I don't know that for a fact, but there are plenty of Albanian Americans who are supporting the Republican Party. It's it's not France, it's not Italy, but there's still Albania is seen as it's a small country, but it's seen as kind of a dynamic place. And I could see a Trump supporter, a MAGA supporter, being either expressing interest or being convinced to go out to Tirana as ambassador. Now, that would be a huge change. Again, for better or for worse, I personally think it would be better to keep a career person. But I think you see what I'm saying, by the fact that Albania is kind of further along, it's now seen as a possible attractive post for a political appointee. In a way, that's good. I mean, that says something about Albania. Kosovo, I think, is a little bit of a different situation. You know, it's just because it's still in a difficult space, you know, not being a UN member. I mean, a career diplomat would love that kind of a challenge, right? You know, to go into something like that. I think for a political appointee, no, a political appointee wants to go into some, you know, a house where the table is set and every, you know, so I'd be very surprised if a political appointee were named for Kosovo. So I think with Albania, for me, it'd probably be 50-50. For Kosovo, it'll be a career officer. But the question is when. You know, this government's got many, many different kinds of priorities. I'm sure Albania and Kosovo ambassadors are not, you know, at the top of the priority list. But don't take this as a diplomatic slight. There are many, many, many countries, you know, where no one has been named. It's just an unfortunate byproduct of the US system. It's not, don't take it personally.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. And, you know, I didn't think about that perspective of a potential political appointee as
Yeah.
Albanians
Yeah.
on the Albanian side.
Again, it's
I could see that.
speculation.
Yeah.
It's all speculation on my part, but I feel pretty strong about it because it's something I've thought about a lot.
Thank you. Yes. So one last question from the audience, and then we kind of have a bigger picture wrap-up question. Indrit Topali asked, you know, you witnessed Albania during a pivotal period in its democratic development. Looking back now, how do you assess the long-term impact and actual outcomes of the judicial reform? In your view, has it achieved the goals of strengthening the rule of law and restoring public trust in the justice system, or has it fallen short of its original promise?
Another very good question and a tough one. Obviously, judicial reform is something that we all support 100%, right? So I don't want to come across as being anything other than positive. But because we're in this forum where we can be very candid and open, I think it's done some good things. I'm talking about Spock and the entire process. And when I was, you know, I felt a lot of Albanians were getting very discouraged, you know, by lack of progress with judicial reform. There was so much talk about it, but it seemed like very little was being done. You know, Euralius was there, American Opdat was there, Council of Europe, but it just seemed like nothing was happening. And meanwhile, the Albanian players on all sides were manipulating things. And so after I left, and Don Liu was the ambassador, and then following him, Yuri Kim, you know, they, together with, you know, their superiors in Washington, came up with this plan for judicial reform. You know, it was pretty comprehensive. It was well thought out and made a lot of sense. I wasn't involved because I was out of it by then. But, you know, I would talk to people who were involved, and it made a lot of sense. Now, to sell it, you know, to convince people that this was real and good, and they found a good partner in Edi Rama and the government, right? You know, because you needed a partner. And that's where there were problems, I think, with Sali Berisha and with Ilir Meta, because they were in the opposition, is seen as maybe obstacles. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but, you know, I think that was the perception. So, because you have to work with the government, you know, if the government's opposed, then it's just not going to happen, or be very, very, very difficult. So, from the American side, you had to really like be enthusiastic, make a big deal of it, right? Plus, because the opinion polls have shown that many Albanians trust Americans more than their own politicians, it's kind of a good thing, right? All things being equal, they're going to trust Americans to at least be a more honest, have, you know, regular Albanians' interests in mind. But see, the problem there is it's a slippery slope. And I get back to my point about, you know what, in the end, it's your country. It's not good if the project, whatever it is something that Americans want more than the Albanians. And I kind of got the sense that there were times when the Americans were so determined for it to succeed that by pushing and promoting and saying, you know, it's up to you, but things are going to be different, they kind of indirectly, inadvertently raised unrealistic expectations. You know, Americans were saying, you know, it's not going to change overnight. You know, we're not the judges, we're not the prosecutors. You know, Albanians are, but we're going to do the training and this and that. You know, it's up to you, but we're behind this. You know, and you know, you want to support the government because, you know, without their support, it's going nowhere. You want to encourage the opposition to be constructive. You know, it's just really, really difficult. You know, it's called threading the needle. You know, you want to be enthusiastic, but not overpromise. And I just had an uneasy feeling from the beginning because I kind of felt like this would happen. You know, it would be a glass half full for some people, a little more than half full for more people, less than half full. And what do you have? A few more prosecutions, or a few more arrests, a few more prosecutions. But the widespread perception to me is still that it's pretty corrupt. I think I'm glad when I hear Albanians say, well, the jury's still out. You know, we'll reserve judgment. We're not happy yet, but, you know, we won't give up on it. I think that's a good answer. But, you know, the fact that a lot of people seem to have doubts, I don't know. But then what would the alternative have been? To do nothing? You know, continue having these contact group meetings with the Europeans and, you know, a small democracy grant, that wouldn't have gotten anywhere. So I don't know, Murat. I'm sorry, you know, the person who asked that question, that's a very thoughtful question. I don't know. I have to say, I think it was good to try. I think it was good to try, because if you don't try, you'll never even have a shot. But unfortunately, I think the way it turned out, but I still think it's the glass is half full, maybe a little bit more than half full. I just wish it was more full than it is. And that people saw it as more full than it is.
Sure. Well, as we close, Ambassador, I want to ask one last broader question. What gives you hope about the future of the Albanian people, whether in Albania, Kosovo, or the Diaspora, and their role on the global stage?
Well, it's something I've said before, and it sounds a little bit like a politically correct answer, but it happens to be true. And that is that when I was there, you know, I visited with university students and even high school students. And all of these people are 10 years older now. Okay. And I've met some of them, you know, either I've stayed in touch with them or they say, oh, you know, you visited my school, or I was part of this group that, you know, that met with you, came to the embassy, something like that. And I asked them, almost all of them speak English really well. They've traveled. Most of them are working. Some are involved in politics, some are not. And so I remember them. I mean, maybe not individually, but I remember, you know, those young people. And, you know, I realize, you know, I believe, and I want to believe that the stuff that we talked about, the stuff that they told me 10 years ago, it's still in their head. It's still in their heart, you know, and maybe one person alone can't change the world, by herself or by himself. But collectively, there's something there, okay? But maybe they can't do it alone. Maybe they need the next generation, you know? So for the new American ambassador, whenever he or she gets there and they go to the schools and they're going to meet these kids who are 15 to 20 years old, you know, so it's that regeneration, the new blood, you know, coming behind you, that's always going to be a little smarter, a little more ambitious, a little more impatient, you know, less patient. As long as the country itself is on the right path, you know, the people who make up, you know, the workforce, the minds and the bodies, you know, the spirit, the spirit of Albania, as long as that's growing, there's always going to be hope. You know, I will be honest with you, when I first went to Albania, not knowing very much about it at all, you know, based on my study of communism, and not that I was an expert or anything, but I know that, you know, communism can really wear people down, and you know it has. I saw it firsthand, but I thought, well, you know, how is the work ethic in Albania? You know, how is, you know, is there a drive to really acquire better skills? You know, higher value skills. I was blown away, you know, by the desire, the ambition, especially of the young people, how smart they were. And I'm still kind of disappointed that the country's not doing better, because I said, you know what? If I were a private company, I'd figure out some way to invest in Albania, or at least get Albanians to come here and work for me, because they're smart, they're very hardworking, they figure things out. I think Albanians are great. I really, really do mean that. And I can't say that for every place I visited or lived, you know? So that gives me hope. It's frustrating because I'm saying, okay, what gives? You know, the people are so great, especially the young people, women too, you know, not just the men. Frankly, the men need to catch up to the women. You know, they're great. But why is the country still kind of chugging along, not growing in leaps and bounds? But I'm convinced that, you know, if this process of rejuvenation, regeneration, you know, I guess Eddie Rama would call it Rylindia or something like that, you know, whatever, you know, whatever you want to call it. But, you know, there has to be this constant refreshing, right? You know, like you hit the refresh button, new blood, new energy, new ways of thinking. And that's something we need in this country too. But you asked about Albania, so that's my answer about Albania.
Thank you. Ambassador, I wanted to thank you for your time. I know that was a lot of questions. Your insight, your continued support of the Albanian people, you know, thank you. Thank you again. Your reflections today are not only informative, they're also a call to action, I think, with that last note, especially. Um, to the audience, thank you for the questions as well. If you believe in the importance of strengthening the Albanian voice in Washington and in the Balkans, we ask you and invite you to join our movement, Albanians for America. Together, we can turn awareness into action and action into impact. Um, so really appreciate your time, Ambassador. I appreciate the attendees and all their great questions. This webinar was recorded, and we'll be sending it out to the participants and others who were not able to join. So your answers, you know, will hit a broader audience within our community. But I wanted to thank you again and thank everyone for joining. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Master. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.